For my presentation this week, I'm going to be talking about The Death of Ivan Ilyich, an 1886 novella written by Leo Tolstoy. Some of the key elements that I'm going to talk about today for The Death of Ivan Ilyich, some of the broader context, both historically and in terms of literature, the structure of the story overall and how that contributes to meaning in the piece, some of the motifs that Tolstoy interweaves throughout the text, the way that he uses narration and particularly embodies shifts in perspective in order to develop meaning in the piece, and then ultimately how he uses a particular set of symbols as well as some metaphorical meaning in order to create a sense of the theme that he's going for here. So just quickly, some social and historical context, a little bit about what was going on at the time that he was writing this. Much like what we saw last week in terms of Kafka's reflection of his culture, the social structure in pre-revolutionary Russia was often depicted as this sort of encompassing and maybe even stagnant set of sort of rules and expectations. There's the sense that social status and particularly how one relates to the broader society and to other members of society is this thing that you can't really escape from, something that's sort of vitally important to figuring out where you stand. And yet it's often governed by these sort of nebulous rules that shift based on these different, sets of expectations, these different situations. In particular, this led to explicit attempts to sort of unpack or elucidate a theme, often things that kind of come directly out and maybe state a lesson. Tolstoy's work in particular, because of a late life conversion to Christianity, is often read with an explicitly moralizing message about faith. One of the common types of writing at this time are either satires that are intended to be a little bit more comedic, or dark comedy, or even tragedy, particularly about domestic situations. Gogol's The Overcoat is one of the sort of seminal works of this time period. Written in 1842, it showcases a series of misfortunes and social stressors that are suffered by a low-level bureaucrat, culminating in his ironic death, which has some connections to some of the elements that we're seeing here with The Death of Ivan Ilyich. Gogol's The Nose, much like Kafka's The Trial, which we read last week, depicts the attempts by an individual to navigate a sort of absurd and unjust system, almost a dreamlike situation that is allegorical for the social structure in which he finds himself. A couple short stories that similarly reflect some of these concerns: Chekhov's The Bet and Home, as well as Tolstoy's own How Much Land Does a Man Need, which are all sort of frequently anthologized texts, offer examinations of morality within the confines of the surrounding culture that individuals find themselves in. Russian writers at the time were frequently concerned with how we construct meaning and how we navigate the social systems and expectations that are placed on us. A quick recap of the story in The Death of Ivan Ilyich. The titular character, Ivan, is a well-respected and fairly successful man. Ivan ultimately experiences an injury while decorating his home. He falls while hanging curtains and bumps his side. This injury gradually progresses to become a very severe illness, and as a result, Ivan's mental and physical condition deteriorates. Eventually, he becomes so despondent at his deteriorating condition, his feeling that death is impending, that he reaches a point of epiphany. In his darkest moment, he has a dramatic shift in perspective. Reevaluating his life and his choices, Ivan ultimately concludes that he didn't live his life correctly. Despite having a typical life, despite doing what was expected of him, he ultimately was off base in terms of what he prioritized. He does die in the end of the novella, but the ending expresses triumph. He expresses hope that because he shifted his perspective, he doesn't need to worry about death. Ivan's friends, following his death, but actually placed narratively towards the beginning of the story, conclude that Ivan's situation wasn't really anything like theirs, and ultimately don't seem to learn much of a lesson. Which brings us to the structure of the story. Interestingly enough, the first chapter actually takes place narratively after Ivan's already dead, and it focuses on his friends reacting to his death. They ultimately refuse to sort of confront their own mortality, and this becomes a reflection of first Ivan's initial attitude towards his own mortality, his refusal to recognize that he too may die, but ultimately contrasts with his eventual epiphany. An interesting element of structure is how Tolstoy develops the narrative lens throughout the text. Tolstoy actually varies the narrative scope so that he can brush past large swaths of Ivan's life and instead focus in on some other particular areas. What he does here is he actually uses the narrative lens itself to mirror the introspection that Ivan uses towards his own life. So, a few of the motifs that seem interrelated in this text, things that Tolstoy plays with and introduces and treats a few different ways in the text. One of the most dominant ones is the idea of confronting mortality. It says on page 4, this had happened to Ivan Ilyich and not to him, and that it should not and could not happen to him, and that to think that it could would be yielding to depression, which he ought not to do. This is a sentiment that would later be echoed by Ivan's own refusal to think about these sort of more negative aspects of life. Ivan, as time goes on and as his illness progresses, comes to confront this own death. He has no choice but to embrace the truth of it. He could not understand it, and he tried to drive this false, incorrect, morbid thought away and to replace it by other proper and healthy thoughts. But that thought, and not the thought only, but the reality itself, seemed to come and confront him. Ivan Ilyich saw that he was dying, and he was in continual despair. In the depth of his heart, he knew he was dying, but not only was he not accustomed to the thought, he simply did not and could not grasp it. A big part of Ivan's journey throughout the text here is in finding a way to confront both his death as well as the implications that it has for the way he's lived his life. Another motif that Tolstoy plays with is the idea of reality versus appearance. It occurred to Ivan that his scarcely perceptible attempts to struggle against what was considered good by the most highly placed people, those scarcely noticeable impulses which he had immediately suppressed, might have been the real thing, and all the rest false. And his professional duties and the whole arrangement of his life and of his family and all his social and official interests might all have been false. He tried to defend all those things to himself and suddenly felt the weakness of what he was defending. There was nothing to defend. Ivan continually feels that he can't make his wife, his friends, or his doctors understand his situation and his feelings, and that he can't convey this, and this somehow makes them false. It makes them hollow in comparison to Ivan, who is struggling to find something true. One of the dominant ideas in this text is shifts in perspective. Much of the text, Ivan is attempting to intentionally ignore the problematic elements of his life and avoid the truth. And yet, ultimately, by the end of the text, he's the only character who seems to have undergone this introspection and seems to have a better grasp of how one's life should be lived. Again, this contributes to the same idea of what is correct versus what is right. Ivan asks prominently, what if my whole life has been wrong? And it's this moment of epiphany, this recognition that the way that he's been behaving may not actually be the way he should have been behaving, that causes Ivan at first great distress, but then ultimately a shift in perspective that seems to bring him a sense of peace, or at the very least, a sense of comfort against his impending death. One of the symbols that Tolstoy uses to develop this idea is the card game bridge. The game itself becomes a metaphor for the expected actions that they're going to take. In the very first chapter, after Ivan's death and after his funeral, his friends turn to play bridge and sort of forget about what they may have learned or had the opportunity to learn through his death. Early on, Ivan's enjoyment of it is mentioned as we speed sort of through his life. Then at the end of chapter 4, after his illness has progressed, Ivan can no longer enjoy a simple game of bridge because his illness keeps distracting him. It keeps cropping back up, and it becomes this nagging sense in the back of his mind that the way that he lived his life maybe is not what he should be doing or what he should be focusing on. The narration and the perspective in this novel is an aspect that supports this idea, this gradual shift. Like many of the other texts that we've looked at, Tolstoy's narrator in The Death of Ivan Ilyich is not just impartially relating facts, but is actually offering some direct commentary, not unlike what we might see in a parable. The opening text suggests that Ivan Ilyich's life had been most simple and most ordinary and therefore most terrible, a point at which the narrator explicitly offers a judgment about the main character. Similarly, as Ivan's decorating his home, we get a phrase like, in reality. In reality, it was just what is usually seen in the houses of people of moderate means who want to appear rich. This suggests that there's more than one layer of truth here. Ivan views things a certain way and then ultimately is not aware of how they actually are. Similarly, just as his drawing room resembled all other drawing rooms, so did his enjoyable little parties resemble all such other parties. The narrator again offers the sense that Ivan is just living according to some preset plan. The perspective gaps that we get here, where the narrator seems aware of some information that Ivan himself is not aware of, foreshadow Ivan's own shift in perspective, foreshadow the way in which he will come to better understand his own position. Late in the text, Ivan considers his previous experiences, and in imagination, he began to recall the best moments of his pleasant life. But strange to say, none of those best moments of his pleasant life now seemed at all what they had then seemed. This suggests that at this point, Ivan has attained that greater sense of perspective, just as the narrator was offering some commentary in terms of what Ivan's actual experiences were like versus what he perceived them as. By this point in the novel, Ivan has now realized his faults. He's realized that he had not recognized things as they truly were. Some of the symbolic meaning that Tolstoy develops throughout the novel, confronting death is compared to sinking into a black bag. That life is compared to a stone that's rolling downhill, something that's sort of inexorably progressing towards this end, towards this final moment, but which Ivan wishes that he could slow down, wishes he could stop, and yet is unable to. And then finally, as Ivan's priorities are reoriented, as he becomes aware of how he should have been living, there's a comparison to a sudden reversal of a train, of realizing that he thought the train was moving one direction and suddenly that it was moving a different direction. This comparison, again, suggests this broadening of perspective, this idea that Ivan's true need was for a shift in his mindset. He didn't just need to be healed of his disease, he needed to have a shift in how he was living his life. A lot of ways we can read Ivan's illness symbolically in this way. Even though the symptoms manifest physically, his dissatisfaction isn't caused by his disease, rather in how it reminds him of the elements of his life which are already wrong, but which he largely ignores. It's even possible to interpret his illness as a net good for Ivan, because even though it did ultimately result in his death, his injury forces him to question the meaning of his life. It enables him to then surpass this fear of mortality, surpass this fear of death that has been so pervasive up to that point. Tolstoy, as do a lot of other writers of the era, sort of takes this idea of juxtaposing mundane elements alongside weighty issues, alongside more metaphysical, significant concepts. And in doing so, he creates this interrelationship between ordinary affairs and these higher pursuits, these more complex issues. Ultimately, Tolstoy's goal here is for readers to similarly question their own conditions. Some questions that we could consider in unpacking the death of Ivan Ilyich this week. I'm curious what you make of Ivan's relationship with his wife. They have a very sort of dysfunctional relationship in a lot of ways, and I'm curious if you think that this is a product of Ivan's misplaced priorities, this thing that he realizes that he's been doing wrong as he goes through his life, or if there's something else at play. What accounts for this dynamic between them that seems more one of animosity than anything else? I'm curious what you think makes Gerasim so different from Ivan's other friends and family. Why is it that Ivan's able to tolerate Gerasim and not these other individuals who he views as false? Ivan experiences a great deal of pain throughout his ordeal, both mental and physical, but that doesn't necessarily excuse the way that he acts towards his friends and family. I'm curious to know if you tend to sympathize more or pity Ivan, or if you blame him for the way he treats his wife and family. Is there something to be said for excusing the action of a man who's facing his death, or should Ivan somehow have known better? Should he have adjusted his behavior in order to treat these people better? I'm curious to know what you think of Tolstoy's faith in relation to this text. I mentioned earlier that Tolstoy's writings are frequently interpreted through a lens of Christianity and explicitly Christian morality. Should we be reading Ivan's death and his epiphany late into his life as a religious conversion? Does he find faith in the end? Does he find grace in the end? Or is this something that maybe we should separate somewhat from Tolstoy's own beliefs? At first, Ivan is very upset and sort of laments the unfairness that he'll die, although he ultimately does come to accept the reality of his mortality. I'm curious where you stand on these two extreme views. Are you more along the lines of early Ivan and the individuals from the opening chapter, where death is something that we sort of push aside, something that we don't want to acknowledge and shouldn't think about? Or is it something that's just a normal part of life, something that we should take in stride and just accept as part of the human condition? I know this is less about the text and maybe a little bit more about our reactions to the text, but I'm very curious to see where you stand along that spectrum. And finally, Ivan considers that his ordinary life might not have been lived correctly. But I'm not sure if we get an explicit message about what the correct way for him to be living is. If this is the case, then what should Ivan have been doing differently, or what was the factor that he needed in his life in order to make it one of meaning?